Congressman Deutch, thank you very much for speaking to the Voice of America. You've been working on the case of former agent, FBI agent Bob Levinson, who went missing in Iran. So the Iranian foreign minister said that Iran has given a list of names of Iranians held by the U.S. Can you confirm the U.S. receiving such a list? And do you think prisoner swap, formal or informal, is in the making?
Well, I can't confirm that yet, but I did see the news and look forward to getting more information now that I'm back in Washington. But the important thing to remember is that the government of Iran has to step up and can no longer be allowed to arbitrarily detain these Americans. It's an issue I've worked on since getting here. Bob Levinson, the longest held American in history, has now been away from his family for more than a decade. And for that entire time, the government of Iran has offered to help and has done nothing to help bring him home. So I saw the story. I hope there's truth to the story. I think the government of Iran has a responsibility, and I think certainly that the government of the United States, in keeping up the pressure on the government of Iran, that pressure should certainly apply to helping to bring home these Americans.
Do you think any kind of swap is possible in times like this of confrontation?
Well, I think that every way that can possibly lead to the release of these arbitrarily detained Americans needs to be pursued. And I don't know what's possible now, but I don't think we can afford to let up in any way with the pressure to take the steps necessary to bring home all of these people, especially Bob Levinson, my constituent from Florida.
Let me talk about the developments in northern Syria. We're seeing Kurds in the city of Kamishlo showing their anger at the U.S. military vehicles leaving Syria to go to Iraq. Then there are pictures showing Kurds being wounded by white phosphorus bombs. At the same time, we hear the U.S. administration talking about leaving, yes, some troops, but just for some time around oil facilities in Syria. So what's your read of these developments?
Well, those images are really painful to see. This is the reason that the House of Representatives overwhelmingly disapproved of the action taken by the administration, by the president, to withdraw our troops and expose the Kurds to exactly what we've seen happening. The Senate here is going to vote on this as well. But what's so frustrating is seeing the Kurds, who so bravely stood with the United States in confronting ISIS, such an important ally, and this is not the right way for the Kurds to be treated as a result. There is continued focus here in Washington on ways to help safeguard the Kurds and to push back against any efforts, the ongoing efforts that we've seen take place that have led to the kind of violence you described.
As a result, one of the results of this offensive is the Russian forces and the Syrian army to gain access to certain areas,
right,
of which they basically lost control for a while. We know that Iranian militias have been helping the Syrian forces. So are you concerned about the Iranians gaining ground, even more ground in Syria?
Yeah, absolutely I am. I'm concerned about a decision that not only betrays the Kurds, but a decision that leaves open the possibility that we will see an increased role for Russia. We'll see obviously greater power to Assad and Turkey, quite obviously, but also Iran. The goal of the government of Iran in Syria has been clear. The government's support for terrorism in Syria has done great harm to the Syrian people, And the ultimate goal for the government and for the regime is to spread this influence and this terrorism throughout the region. That's, I think, what we have to work really hard to ensure doesn't happen, and that's what we're focused on now after this decision was made.
Is your sense, but maybe I would talk to you also as representative of the Congress
Sure.
here, that the U.S. could really leave the Middle East militarily, disengage from the Middle East without leaving at least a diplomatic engagement behind or a diplomatic solution behind? Just leave.
No.
Could the U.S. afford that? Could the Middle East afford that?
No, and in fact, despite some of the language coming from the White House, the United States isn't leaving the region, isn't leaving the Middle East, isn't leaving the entire region at all. In fact, there's been an increase in the number of personnel who have moved into the region. It's important to remember that when we hear statements about ending all wars and bringing all the troops home, if we're going to lead diplomatically, it needs to be clear to our allies in the region that we're working with them to confront the very real challenges that they face, certainly not the least of which is the potential resurgence of ISIS. And that's again why it's so important for us to be clear that we have an important role to play. It's an important role we need to play as a leader in the region.
Yes, more troops in Saudi Arabia and less troops in Syria have a different weight on the ground and also a different weight in diplomatic talks in the region, right?
Well, there's no question about that. And the decision, the president's announcement to withdraw all of the troops from Syria, we've talked about, it sends exactly the wrong message and leads to the kinds of really significant challenges throughout Syria and the region as a result. That's why you're seeing action taken by Congress to not only to disapprove of that, but to really increase the pressure to make clear that those of us who pay close attention to the region understand that we have to be present, and it doesn't require a large military force, but it also means not focusing entirely on protecting oil fields, but in fact on protecting our allies and standing with those who have stood with us, especially when the threats from the regime in Tehran continue to mount as they see an opportunity in the region.
So given this context, next time that the Iranian regime is going to announce new actions to resume the nuclear program, so the next step, as that we've been doing recently, and then checking the reactions of Europeans and Americans. So how should the U.S. respond next time there is a new step in the nuclear program in Iran?
Well, when the White House talks about, the president talks about maximum pressure, that pressure needs to be across the board. It must mean that we can't tolerate these efforts by the government of Iran to keep pushing to see how far they could go on the nuclear program. We need to stand with our allies and against those attempts to try to find ways to work even outside of the nuclear agreement, ways that will further alienate the government of Iran, that will create more disruption and dissension in the region. We just have to be very clear about that and make sure that we're all working together in tandem to make sure that we can't allow that to simply continue.
Working together with whom? So dialogue with whom? With the Iranian government or with
no. With our allies who understand that Iran can't be allowed. The government can't be allowed to violate these agreements. The government can't be allowed to try to keep pushing the envelope toward developing nuclear weapons, which the United States and our allies won't tolerate, and that the government's ongoing efforts to spread terror throughout the region and its ongoing efforts to violate the human rights of the Iranian people at home, that we all have an obligation to stand on the side of peace in the region, stand on the side of those who are clamoring for human rights and standing up to repression, the repression of the Iranian regime.
So let's say that sanctions alone are not enough if there is no political efforts for more dialogue through the Europeans, with the Europeans on this matter.
Well, there's no question it's more challenging when it looks like, when decisions are made that make it look like we're, as you described earlier, we're leaving the Middle East. But we're not leaving the Middle East, and as long as that's clear, then our leadership with our allies, I think, is what needs to be central to these efforts.
So there must be some effort to change the perception, because unfortunately this is a perception that people are getting on the ground.
Right, I understand that, but for the overwhelming majority of elected officials in Washington, D.C., in the United States Congress, who have voted to disapprove of these decisions about removing troops, it's up to us in interviews like this to make sure that the people in the region, that the people in Iran understand that we continue to recognize the importance of being there for our allies and being there to stand up for those whose human rights are violated whether it's by the Iranian regime or others throughout the Middle East.
So let me touch on the last question. I don't know if it's a coincidence, but President Erdogan of Turkey just said that Turkey might pursue nuclear weapons. So now what should Americans here and Iranians in Iran think about it?
Well, the message has been clear from Washington for some time, and it's a message that the president must back up in his conversations with Erdogan, that a nuclear arms race in the region is not something that can be acceptable. And no, is it a coincidence that he's making the statement now? It isn't, which is why it's so important that he hear loudly and clearly that a nuclear arms race, as I said, is not in the best interest of our country here in America. It's certainly not in the best interest of the region. It would make it more dangerous, exceedingly so. That should never be the goal.
Just to follow up on your previous answer, you are chairman of the subcommittee here in the House in charge of international terrorism. We are hearing about the risk of ISIS resurgence. What is the situation that you're seeing on the ground? That what's happening really there?
Right. So the concern obviously is that the ISIS fighters who were being held in jails and makeshift jails, schools, other things, but were being held, thousands of them, that they not return to the battlefield, and after this decision, this unfortunate decision about removing American troops, there has been a real focus on making sure that they not be released. Unfortunately, it's hard to track the extent to which there's been success in ensuring that they're not able to go back onto the battlefield. I don't have more information on that. That is the most urgent initial focus right here. It has to be on preventing ISIS fighters from re-engaging at the same time that we are trying to prevent slaughter of the Kurds. That's got to be a focus, and it is.
Congressman, thank you very much for your time.
Thank you. I appreciate it.